Every Friday we turn to some of the press gallery's deepest thinkers to pick apart the week that was, and this week is no different. Joining us in the studio today, we've got political reporter with the ABC's RN Breakfast, Krishani Danji. Welcome. From National Radio News, Amanda Kopp, political reporter, joins us. And from the Australian Financial Review, political correspondent Tom McElroy. Welcome to all three of you. Clearly, there's a lot happening tomorrow. The Voice, that little thing that we've been talking about for months and months, if not years now. Krishani, we haven't really learned a whole lot this week that we didn't already know. It seems like the campaigns have got their messaging pretty set ahead of polling day.
Yeah, absolutely. And the difference between this, of course, and a regular election campaign, which is really what most people have to compare this to, I certainly wasn't 18 at the time of the last referendum, that the issues don't really change very much. So the messaging has been really similar and really hasn't changed over the last week. The only difference is that the number of people that are undecided is slowly getting smaller, but the latest YouGov polling still shows that it's around 6% of Australians who still don't know what side of the fence that they sit on, and there are also a lot of people that are probably within the soft yes or the soft no camp. And so that messaging is still really important for those people who haven't yet engaged or fully engaged with the issues, which is why we've seen such a big campaign blitz from both yes and no sides, telling people to get involved, to understand the issues. But as you say, the messaging really hasn't changed.
The issue of engagement is always an interesting one, Amanda Kopp, when it comes to any sort of democratic exercise, because there are always going to be some people who don't turn their mind to this until the very last moment. Putting aside the fact millions have already pre-polled, that is still clearly an active consideration for both the yes and the no camp, because it's a binary option here when people get into the polling booths.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the AEC, the Australian Electoral Commission, is thinking that around 50% of Australians are going to pre-poll vote. So tomorrow it's going to be another 50% of people who are going to be going to the polls. But I mean, in terms of people who, perhaps haven't decided yet or, haven't quite engaged yet, I found it particularly interesting. I think it was actually on the RN program that Krishani's on, where they had a whole lot of vox pops or, people on the street, how they'd voted, why they'd voted that way. And the one that I found particularly interesting was this guy who had voted no and sort of made these comments around what he didn't think that The Voice was going to do. And then the reporter was like, oh, no, that's actually what The Voice is going to do, what you want to happen. And he said, oh, right, well, guess I got that one wrong. And, his response to that was that he'd heard some messaging on TikTok, and that was what informed his vote. So I think it's really interesting, when we get all of these press releases saying, the yes campaign's going here, the no campaign's going there, when a lot of the time people aren't even tuning into what politicians are saying. It's what's going on social media a lot of the time.
And Tom McElroy, it is an interesting point there about, I guess, people learning from social media. The politicians are still somewhat stuck in a bit of a old school campaigning technique, but there is a lot of information being spread out there that they don't have control of. How much do you think that is going to play into this campaign?
Well, I think the Yes campaign is relying heavily on younger voters, and as we've heard from the Vox Pops, they're heavily influenced by TikTok, other platforms, Instagram. I've been struck at the nature of some of those videos, rebutting statements from campaigners and from politicians or seeking to put them in better context. Often I think they're more catchy, more interesting to the viewer than the politicians are capable of delivering. But the flip side of that is there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation going around. One Vox Pop I heard this week was a woman who was at Uluru who believed that The Voice would lead to Uluru being sold. She'd voted no. It's just extraordinary, there's no suggestion that that could ever happen, that would ever happen, such a sacred site for Indigenous people. But whether she wanted to believe it or whether she was led to believe it based on the content, it worked for her, she voted no. I think that's going to be part of the wash-up. How do we understand what's happening online, and is there a way to improve the information that's there?
Yeah, and it is interesting just seeing how quickly that spreads throughout the community. When we're talking about campaigners, there's been a lot of discussion as to who are the most prominent or even the most effective campaigners on both the yes and the no side. And someone who has been away from our screens and away from much of the public eye during this situation, this debate, has been Pat Dodson, the father of reconciliation. He did make an appearance, though, at the National Press Club from Broome, where he is based. He's currently battling quite a serious illness there. And he had this to say about how the polling is currently suggesting that the No campaign has the upper hand.
I'll wait until the Australian people make their mind and their wishes clear. I'm not going to be ruled by polls. If we want to be governed by polls, then why would we have a government? We just want a poll straw and decide how we're going to work and live. Now, I think the Australian people, and there are many of them, that are still to vote, and I'd encourage them to vote yes in this referendum. There's nothing to fear here. There's only good to come out of this. There's a vision to come out of this, and there's hope to come out of this.
Pat Dodson at the National Press Club earlier this week. It is an interesting situation where we do have this. Personality comes into play here as well when putting these messages out there, Chris Sharney. He is still clearly hopeful that more Australians will vote yes, even though the polling is saying that it looks like an uphill battle.
Yeah, well, there's two really interesting things to that. One of them is that the Yes campaign does have a lot more volunteers on the ground. And so what I've noticed just from being around and having voted myself was that when I went to go pre-poll, there were a few Yes campaigners and there weren't any No campaigners. And when we were saying earlier about the fact that there are still a lot of people who are either on the fence or a soft yes or no, that will make, I think, a fairly big difference when people are coming in to vote. The other thing is that there are some expectations that there might be less voter turnout in this referendum, which would potentially not benefit the No side. And so that's why we've seen messages from the likes of Peter Dutton, from Warren Mundine, saying, please actually go out there and do vote and do make your voice heard, because that could potentially impact their vote over the Yes vote. And so those are two things that could potentially shape a slightly different outcome to what we've been seeing in the polls, but it is going to be difficult for them.
It is an interesting point. I'm glad you took us to that, because even the AEC today has put out a statement reminding people that voting in the referendum is compulsory. Such an unknown concept for so many Australians because they haven't voted in a referendum before. It is quite remarkable that the No campaign, Amanda Kopp, is telling people don't be complacent, don't sit at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this is one of those scenarios where, we have had so much commentary on the polls, a pretty consistent downslide in the support for the yes vote. And so, we're almost talking about the referendum as if, we already know the result. But we don't. The classic phrase in this place is, the only poll that matters is on election day. And in this case, it's on referendum day. And so I think that, that possibility that people haven't switched on, they haven't been paying attention, not only to the messaging, but to the fact that they actually have to go and vote is a real possibility. And, it feels like Chris Sharney said, that people who are perhaps voting yes are maybe more engaged than perhaps the people who might be voting no.
Tom, you were in the Red Centre this week when the Prime Minister headed out there, along with a number of other senior members of the government. He got quite emotional at one stage when he was sitting with some Indigenous women. I think it was on Monday or Tuesday night, and they were talking about the Uluru Statement. They were singing a song there. What was the rationale behind him heading to Uluru in the final week of the campaign?
I think they were looking for a symbolic moment. I think they knew that the optics in the last week of a campaign is important. They wanted to remind voters of where this thing came from, 2017, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The PM said that he'd made a promise to Pat Farmer that he'd be there at the end of his 14,500 kilometre run. That was the next day. It was quite an emotional moment. I have to say I thought he looked pretty worn out. It's been a long campaign for him personally, and he set a pretty frenetic pace. But when he was sitting there with the women and sitting in the dirt holding the replica of the Statement from the Heart, my thought was it was difficult to question his motives. He believes he's kept a promise with the architects of the Uluru Statement. He believes it's the right thing to do. That doesn't mean that a yes vote is more likely. I think it's going to be difficult, and I think he's going to have to work pretty hard to keep the process of closing the gap and of a proper reconciliation on track after this. What could be, Amanda's right, we don't know the result, what could be quite a heavy defeat for a big political project for Anthony Albanese.
Yeah, he has attached a lot of his own personal political capital to this this cause, but of course everyone is looking ahead to what could happen on the 15th and beyond, particularly as we go into a parliamentary sitting week and that the cacophony that comes along with that. It is interesting that this debate around how taxing the discussion about the referendum has been not only for the broader community but for the Indigenous community and the sort of healing that will need to happen as a result of that. Jacinta Price, prominent No campaigner and the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, gave a hint as to what she thinks will be the next steps following the outcome on Sunday.
We're not suffering from the sorts of things that the Jewish people in Israel are currently suffering from, the horrific violence that they're experiencing. And as a country, we need to reflect on how good we've got it so that we can move forward together with positivity and stop trying to make changes that are born out of grievance. That's what we need to do as a country. That's how we'll get results.
Jacinta Price speaking there up in the top end. Krishani, it is going to be quite a task to try to bring everyone back together because they are approaching, they're both wanting to improve the lot for Indigenous Australians but coming at it from very different directions.
It's going to be tough to do, and it will be interesting to see what happens in this next sitting fortnight. I think what we'll also be telling is the leaders' speeches come Saturday night once we know the result and what tone that sets for the next weeks and for the next months as well. But Noel Pearson has said for quite a while now that it will be almost impossible to achieve reconciliation if the country votes no to this. This morning we had Ken Wyatt on RN Breakfast, who was also saying that it will be very difficult, particularly for the coalition, to build trust amongst Indigenous people and First Nations voters in coming elections. So it will be difficult. There's been a lot of misinformation. There's been a lot of really damaging, a lot of vile language that we've seen throughout this campaign. It will be hard to build trust again between people.
I do want to touch briefly on the crisis in the Middle East, and it seems like we're doing it a disservice by only talking about it briefly, but such are our time constraints this Friday afternoon. There's been a lot of reaction in Australia about the community uproar that we have seen as a result of the war between Israel and Gaza. Amanda Kopp, a lot of the talk around the protests, the tone of the protests and the response from police and from governments has become pretty fraught, hasn't it?
It sure has. We had Peter Dutton himself, the opposition leader, coming out and saying that people who perhaps weren't permanent residents or citizens of Australia at that protest who were behaving badly should have their visas cancelled. I think this is, we had Mike Burgess as well, the head of ASIO, come out and say that we should avoid inflammatory language. And I think that if we're going to point at any kind of inflammatory language, that is probably one of them. I think the thing to remember in scenarios like this is that emotions are running high on both sides, and that here in Australia, people do have the right to protest. Obviously, that needs to be sort of constrained in terms of how that happens. We can't have people being vilified. We can't have threats of violence. But I think that we do need to remember that people do have a right to protest in this country. And as long as they're doing that in the right way, then they should be able to.
Tom McElroy, how difficult is it for the government at a federal level to set that sort of tone when you clearly have a very complex geopolitical, humanitarian situation unfolding halfway around the globe that is wrapped up in decades, if not centuries of history, and it's telling everyone to calm down when there are lives at risk here and lives which have already been lost that many people in the Australian community would have a deep connection to.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't come more complex than this particular set of conflicts, and a terrorist attack will always be an extremely emotional thing, even for people who don't have a direct connection. I think the government's working hard to bring people home. We heard about the 19 Australians trying to get out of Gaza. We're hearing about repatriation flights. I think that's very appropriate. You played Penny Wong earlier in the program. I thought her comments were very sound. It's clear that Anthony Albanese's trust in her is warranted. in terms of steering the response. And I think they're going to get some political heat as well. Peter Dutton wants to put pressure on. That's his job as the opposition leader, and he's been doing that in the past few days. I don't envy their challenges, and I think if Australia can continue to show strong support to Israel, continue to protect free speech, as Amanda says, that's a very good thing.
And I think it is indicative of the fact that, while no one is excusing the serious incident that has happened over the course of the past week or so, there is still, you can say that is abhorrent and appalling behaviour by Hamas, but also still, be reflective of the situation that the Palestinian authorities have been put in over many years. We do have to wrap up our conversation on that note. Krishani, Amanda, Tom, thank you so much for joining us on Afternoon Briefing today.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
And a reminder, we will have the most comprehensive coverage of the referendum tomorrow night here on the ABC. From 5 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Time, Jeremy Fernandez will bring you a national edition of ABC News with our team across the country, bringing you the latest as those final votes are cast. And then from 5:30, David Spears, Bridget Brennan, Dan Borscher, Anthony Green, Laura Tingle, Isabella Higgins and Patricia Carvelis, a smorgasbord of the ABC's sharpest minds, will bring you the results as they come to hand and help make sense of it all. That is it for us here on Afternoon Briefing for this Friday. We'll be back on Monday with that referendum result likely to dominate next week's parliamentary proceedings here in Canberra. Stay with us. Your latest headlines are next. For the ABC's team here in the nation's capital, I'm Matthew Doran. Have a great weekend.